via Zoom during the coronavirus of 2020. I'm Dr. Frank Speidel, retired emergency physician and recovering hospital administrator. And thanks for watching The Doctor Is In, where we explore issues in U.S. healthcare. But first, a disclaimer. For as Shakespeare reminds us, foolery, sir, does walk about the orb like the sun. It shines everywhere. So I invite you to consider my comments with utmost robust skepticism. I am neither an epidemiologist, public health official, nor infectious disease special. I invite you always to defer to guidance from your primary physician, local health department, or the CDC. And a wonderful source for information on vaccines is the CHOP website for vaccine education. As I wrote my introduction for today's show, COVID-19 had taken more than 162,000 American lives. We remain masked in fear. Many of us are in fear. Many of us are stressed by both the disease and our contracted economy. Perhaps some good news is needed. As a species, we have decorated history with our foolery, violence, ignorance, and ego. Yet I think, overwhelming this dirge of idiocy are soaring acts of wit, creation, and compassion. Against all the gong shows and inquisitions, we have Bach's Goldberg variations, Bob Dylan, and first responders running into burning buildings. Up there with the Brandenburg concertos, EDM, and chapel ceilings is the invention of vaccines. Vaccines have set us free from iron lungs and crippled life, free from hepatic and cervical carcinomas, free from convulsing deaths, free from life-depriving rigidity. And they free us not by treating a disease one patient at a time, but by preventing on a disease on a scale that is dimensioned in millions. Not a bad day's work. A few words about the history of vaccines, a review, and then a question. Vaccines, vaccinations, what are they? It's the process of exposing a patient to something that promotes the patient's immune system to develop defenses against harmful infectious diseases. Where did this goofy old Latin word come from? Smallpox, variola, has been through time a lethal disease with a mortality in the range of 30 to 40%. Going back to the 16th century, there is evidence to suggest that inoculation of individuals with smallpox debris, variolation will lead us to a lesser mortality rate of 2 to 4% versus 30 to 40% from the natural disease. This practice of variolation to lessen mortality was advocated and practiced in the 18th century. In fact, there's substantial evidence that this practice, variolation, existed in the Middle Ages and probably before. Now, cowpox is a non-lethal disease caused by a virus of the same family as smallpox. Some had noted and suspected that those infected with the relatively benign cowpox were immune to the lethal smallpox. From this background, at the end of the 18th century, Dr. Edward Jenner inoculated James Phillips with debris from a cowpox lesion. Young James subsequently had immunity to smallpox. As the cowpox disease and the related virus was labeled vaccinia, the practice of using a benign agent to develop immunity to a lethal agent had become known as vaccination. The 19th century saw an explosion of efforts to prevent or mitigate other infectious diseases by vaccination. This has continued through the 20th century. I grew up in a time of terror of polio. I practiced in a time where every ED shift was accented by sweaty apprehension of airway closing epiglottitis due to Haemophilus influenza wheeling through the ER doors, or of life-destroying meningococcemia sitting in the waiting room waiting to be seen. No more. Let's look at the illnesses that vaccines have freed us from. Hepatitis A and B, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, pneumococcal disease, polio, influenza, measles, mumps, rubella, varicella, human papillomavirus, meningococcal disease. Now, a word of caution. Some see vaccine for SARS-CoV-2 as the answer to the COVID-19 pandemic. In 1955, the U.S. began a massive campaign through the use of the just licensed Salk vaccine to provide nationwide immunity to polio, a lethal, crippling infectious disease. The Salk vaccine was a live vaccine where the virus has been weakened or attenuated so as to prompt immunity without causing the disease. Unfortunately, 200,000 were inoculated with the Salk vaccine manufactured by Cutter Laboratories that contained a virulent, not the intended attenuated virus. From this virulent vaccine virus, 70,000 became sick, 200 were paralyzed, and 10 died. Now, some vaccines are given post-exposure to individuals, but for COVID-19, the expectation is to vaccinate massively a well population. Our expectation ought to be that the vaccine is effective, and emphatically, the vaccine must be safe. These times are challenging. I am concerned that fears and anxiety may trample appropriate and considered safety concerns. Usually, vaccine development is done in terms of years, not months. To bring clarity and consideration and perspective, I can think of no better guest than Dr. Paul Offit. Dr. Offit is the Director of Vaccine Education and Professor of Pediatrics in the Infectious Disease section of the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He is the Maurice or Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Offit is a member of the Institute of Medicine of the National Academy of Sciences. He has been elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, same class as Judy Collins. He has written more than 150 papers, has invented a rotavirus vaccine recommended for use by the CDC. He has authored multiple books and has been recipient of the Sabin Vaccine Institute Gold Medal. Dr. Offit's works in leadership have been recognized and honored by a list of institutions that is measured in terabytes. To name a few, signed the doctor's accomplishments I offer: University of Pennsylvania, University of Maryland, University of Pittsburgh, the University of Sciences, Drexel University, the College of Physicians, the American Association of Physicians, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Association of Medical Colleges. The list is endless. Beyond his wit, insight, and work, the professor has courage. His works and writing have brought the anger and attention of those who dwell in the land of pseudoscience, who worship the empty pronouncements and foolery of the failed prophet of autism, Andrew Wakefield. Lastly, if Professor Offit looks familiar, it's no surprise. He's been on 60 Minutes, Nova, Frontline, Nightline, C-SPAN. Virtually every meaningful show save the Muppet Show. The professor has been interviewed by Dan Rather, Christina Amanpour, Stephen Colbert, Matt Lauer, and many more. I like to think that, like the wine at the marriage feast of Cana, the best interviewer has been saved for last. I am honored to have this brave, tireless, clear voice for reason and science as our guest on The Doctor Is In. Welcome to The Doctor Is In, Professor Offit.
Thank you.
What did I get wrong in my intro?
It was all good. I think the one thing is a slight modification is Jonas Salk's vaccine was actually an inactivated vaccine, and the problem with Cutter Laboratories is they didn't inactivate it. That was really the problem.
Okay, I'm staying corrected and educated.
But otherwise, good.
Who's Maurice Hilleman?
So Dr. Hilleman, I really think was the father of modern vaccines. He did either the primary research or development on 9 of the 14 vaccines that we give to children today. I mean, I would argue that he has saved our lives. I mean, if you look 100 years ago, we live about 30 years longer than we did 100 years ago. And vaccines are one of the big reasons, and Maurice Hilleman is one of the big reasons why. I think he is really arguably the greatest scientist who ever lived. He is estimated to save several million lives every year, and he was an amazing guy. I mean, you especially would love him. I mean, given your personality, he grew up, in the wilds of Montana. He cursed like a sailor. He's probably, when I actually was fortunate enough to interview him in the last 6 months of his life, which became sort of the heart of a book that I wrote about him called Vaccinated. And the challenge for me always was, because he cursed all the time, was, do I include that? Do I write ellipsis? Do I say expletive deleted? And I ended up just sort of putting it in there. So it's probably the only book that has the phrase polymerase chain reaction right in the same sentences as one of the F words.
Well, you have an interest. Well, you're an interesting man, obviously, Professor. But I guess Professor Hilleman and Dr. Kaprowski, what a combination! If you work with those two, you have seen the waterfront.
I tell you, both had enormously strong, overwhelming, bigger than life personalities. You just felt you were in the presence of greatness. You just felt like a little ant in their presence.
You know how I feel interviewing you, then, good sir. Hey, is immunity a binary state? Or the degrees of immunity?
There's degrees of immunity. I mean, some people have higher titered, better and longer lasting immunity than others. I mean, we're an outbred population, so we differently respond to natural infections and we respond differently to vaccination. So no, it's not binary. That's a great question.
How can we become immune?
How do you become immune?
Yes.
That's the question. So, well, the way you'd like to become immune is with vaccination, because with vaccination, you can get the immunity that is generally a consequence of natural infection without having to pay the price of natural infection. I mean, natural infection gives you generally better, longer lasting immunity. I mean, you and I are of an age, I suspect, where we both had measles as children. If you compare that to, for example, people that now get the measles vaccine, you and I probably have higher titers, about threefold higher in our circulation, and a greater frequency of so-called memory immune cells, B and T cells. But the fact of the matter is that the measles vaccine eliminated measles from the United States. So the issue with vaccines isn't are they as good as natural infection? The issue is, are they good enough to eliminate the disease?
Aren't there some diseases where vaccination gives us a better immunity than what we would get from naturally acquiring the disease?
That's a great question, and it's a question nobody ever asks, and the answer is yes, surprisingly. I mean, take tetanus, for example. If you get tetanus, it's because this particular bacterium, Clostridium tetani, makes a toxin, a protein that has a toxic effect called tetaноspasmin. It doesn't take much tetaноspasmin to give you the signs of symptoms of tetanus, sort of muscle rigidity, a lockjaw, sort of something called epistatonus, where you sort of do this with your head. In fact, it's so little that it's sub-immunogenic, meaning it's just like at the picogram level. I mean, it's just billionths of a gram that of that tetaноspasmin to cause disease. So even after you've gotten tetanus, you still aren't immune to tetanus. So that's why people who get tetanus are still recommended to get a tetanus vaccine.
So that means that I can acquire diseases out there and not develop immunity to them. Yeah, there's some that seem to be recurring, unfortunately, even though we've had them. We won't go there. I think you and I both know those kind of problems. I used to treat them all the time in the emergency department. So I think HPV is one that comes to mind. That does give us better immunity than we do from the natural illness, doesn't it?
You're surprising me. Nobody knows this. I mean, I for all the interviews that I've done, nobody really understands that. You're right. HPV vaccine does give immunity that is higher titered and apparently longer lasting than natural infection. It's the nature of the vaccine, which is a so-called virus-like particle. You can actually give so much of this, much more than you would naturally acquire just from being infected. So yeah, HPV is another one. I mean, another one would be something like the so-called Haemophilus influenza B. I mean, when you get that as a young child, you actually don't make, meaning a less than 2-year-old, you don't make a very good immune response to that, because because babies, children less than 2 years of age, don't make very good immune responses to that sort of complex sugar coating, so-called polysaccharide that sits on the surface of the bacteria. The vaccine is not just that. The vaccine is that polysaccharide, but it's linked to a harmless protein. So it induces a much better immune response. So even babies who recover from Haemophilus influenza B, as say the less than 2-year-old, still benefit from that vaccine.
I am personally grateful for that vaccine. There is no greater terror than having the child come in with epiglottitis and you're the only kid there. You have to, we used to live in terror of it, and all you can do is go for the bubbles in the edema. I've had 2 of those cases and the Lord was with me. I was successful on the intubations, but you don't want to ever do that more than once. That is the worst day of your life.
You are a fellow traveler. When people ask me what was the most terrifying of the vaccine-preventable diseases, I say HIV because of epiglottitis. I mean, We had a room actually in the emergency department, which was dark. It had an aquarium. We would bring those children into the room because you wanted to keep them quiet.
Yes, yes.
They didn't spasm and thus close off their windpipe, while the anesthesiologist would come down and gradually bring them up to the operating room. I mean, that disease scared me more than anything else. And interestingly, a few years ago, there was a case of Hib in a suburb of Philadelphia, and the child was brought to the emergency room by ambulance. I mean, you know, we never would have done that, which tells you that people have sort of forgotten about this disease.
That's, yes. I mean, I understand that completely. I feel there's many of these diseases that have become memory diseases. We still see measles, unfortunately. That's, you know, it's the world we're given, but we have a wonderfully effective vaccine. Hey, which vaccines do you think are the most effective?
The most effective vaccine is the measles vaccine. I mean, if you get 2 doses of the measles vaccine, 97% of people who get 2 doses of that vaccine are protected against measles for the rest of their life. And not only that, it's so-called sterilizing immunity, meaning you're protected against mild to moderate to severe disease as well as reinfection. I mean, you don't even get reinfected, which is remarkable. No other vaccine is really that effective as the measles vaccine.
Speaking about vaccine effectiveness, on June 28th of this year, Dr. Fauci, head of the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases, said, I would settle for a 70 to 75% effective vaccine. What's it mean when you say a vaccine's 70% effective?
Well, it depends what your clinical endpoints were in the trial. I think when the clinical endpoints for these trials, meaning the COVID-19 vaccine trials, are going to be moderate to severe disease. You're trying to prevent moderate to severe disease, which is to say the kind of disease that causes you to go to the hospital or causes you to go to the morgue. That's what you're trying to prevent. If we could get 75% efficacy against moderate to severe disease, I think that would be great. I hope we can get that. But what doesn't that mean? What it means also is that you're probably not going to be protected against asymptomatic infection or mildly symptomatic infection, which means you can still shed. Plus, if 75% of people are protected, that means 25% aren't, which means that even though they've gotten the vaccine, they still could get the disease and get sick from it, or could even get mild disease and shed the virus. So I think this is going to be a hard sell. But people who've gotten vaccinated probably should still wear masks because they still are likely either to catch or transmit that virus.
My experience, which is minuscule, is that people aren't very compliant with our influenza vaccine. I think we run around general population around 45%. So if we have a vaccine that's maybe 70% effective and 45% of the population gets it, it's not a big change on the herd, is it?
No, I think there's actually a formula for this to figure out what percentage of the herd needs to be vaccinated to stop spread. It depends on 2 things. One is the contagiousness of the virus, and 2 is the efficacy of the vaccine. The contagiousness of this virus, so-called R0, the reproducibility index is 2, meaning that if I'm sick and I go about my normal day and everybody I come in contact with is susceptible, I'll infect 2 people. If the efficacy of the vaccine, let's say, was 75%, the formula that you plug into would mean that you would need to immunize about 2/3 of the American population to stop spread. If the vaccine was 100% effective, which no vaccine is, but if the vaccine were 100% effective, you'd need to vaccinate half the population. If the vaccine were 50% effective, you'd need to vaccinate 100% of the population, which you also can't do because some people can't be vaccinated. So that's the story. But I think they're really, hopefully when they read out these efficacies, that it's read out in terms of what percentage of, what's the protection against shedding, because that's really the issue in terms of what kind of percentage of herd immunity you need. It's going to be a slow process. I think it's going to be a couple of years really before we climb our way out of this.
Are there, let me follow up on that. It's a slow process. It's going to be well. So you mean if we get a vaccine, I don't know how we're going to do it before the end of the year, we produce it. We're looking at this for not terms of months. We're talking in terms of years, aren't we?
I think so. I mean, I agree with you. I can't imagine just how we could finish phase 3 trials, meaning trials of 30,000 people by the end of the year, because you have to give 30,000 people one dose. You have to wait a month, give them a next dose. Then it takes about 2 weeks after that before they have full immunity. And then you have to hope that enough people in your placebo group, which will be about, let's say 10,000 people got a placebo, you have to have at least 150 people get moderate to severely ill, remembering that most people who get this infection are asymptomatic or mildly ill. So you're talking about 20% of people, and you have to be able to introduce this vaccine, hopefully in areas where these outbreaks are occurring. And at the same time, remember, this never gets sort of picked up by the media, you're telling people to still wear masks and socially distance. So in many ways, you don't want them to get sick, but the only way you're going to know whether or not your vaccine works is if they do get sick. So it's a conundrum. I can't imagine we would be done by the end of the year, hopefully early next year. And then it's a matter of rolling it out. So the CDC estimates that the first line responders, meaning the first group that's going to get this vaccine, would probably entail about 120 million people for what is likely to be a 2-dose vaccine. That's 240 million doses that you have to get out there. That's going to be a tour de force, I think, for us to really be able to do that.
Naively, I think in some ways, Paul is the professor. In some ways, is the toothpaste out of the tube. I haven't seen any good prevalence studies, and the prevalence studies I've seen scare me. I have seen the one out of Stanford suggests anywhere between 50 and 85 times the number of observed cases, documented cases, may be out there. What's your sense of how prevalent this disease is right now?
Right. So the best way to figure that out is to do antibody studies, because people who are mildly infected or asymptomatically infected are unlikely to have been tested. But they should, in theory, develop an immune response which is detectable. So I think, as a general rule, when you do antibody studies, you find that you're way off in terms of the number of people who were actually infected. The one study that I saw was not quite as high as the Stanford study. It was about 10-fold greater. So in other words, when we're saying that there's roughly 5 million cases, say now, in the United States, it's probably closer to 50 million.
I think that's increasing because people are out there mixing around, even though they're masked, even though they're doing all the right things, social distancing, it seems to still be spreading. Of course, as you and I both know, many people aren't. Many people are mask free and are gathering in clusters. Now, if we have just one serotype, I think right now for COVID-19, vaccines should do pretty well. It's mutating though. At some point, it has many species that it's a host to, that can host it. Are we going to see something like the influenza vaccine where we're going to have to each year kind of roll dice or use really smart people to figure out what the vaccine should look like for the coming season?
Yeah, actually, this virus is so elusive and difficult to characterize and has had so many surprises, both just in terms of clinical and pathological entities. I probably shouldn't ever make a prediction about this virus. I mean, I made a prediction on Christiane Amanpour's program in early March, and I said I didn't think it would be as bad as flu, which killed 60,000 people this year. But I was wrong. I mean, we certainly have far more than that, as you mentioned, over 160,000 deaths. So I've been wrong about this virus. But I would say this, it's a single-stranded RNA virus. Therefore, its replication isn't particularly faithful. So it does mutate, just like measles virus mutates and mumps virus mutates and rubella or German virus mutates. All of those are also single-stranded RNA viruses. The question is whether the mutation results in a functional change. That's the critical question.
Serotype change.
It looks like at one level it has, which is that it looks like it has become the so-called D to G mutation, has caused it to be more contagious, which is interesting. But it doesn't look like that spike protein, which is the key protein. This is the protein that attaches the virus to cells. If that protein starts to mutate away from the vaccine, which is what influenza does. In influenza virus, it's not a spike protein, it's called the hemagglutinin. That mutates so much from one year to the next, the natural infection or immunization the previous year doesn't protect you. It doesn't look like that's happened yet with the spike protein. So you're right. I think for right now, we can still say it's a single serotype. Hopefully it will stay that way, because if this virus mutates away from the vaccine, this is going to be even more of a nightmare than it already is.
Closing question, Professor. Has fear, fueled by a media where sensational reporting wins the rating contest, caused us to lose perspective, to fail to consider the trade-offs, the risks and rewards of the actions of our society. I'm getting the sense that fear is driving us more than thought. Am I off?
No, you're not. I mean, I think this pandemic is two-pronged. The first is the virus causes suffering and hospitalization and death. True. Our response to it, which has been to try and shut things down, also has its own consequences. I mean, we have suffered massive joblessness, which was resulting in massive homelessness, food insecurity, the kinds of mental health problems that invariably follow those phenomena, like depression, suicide. Child abuse is on the rise, domestic abuse is on the rise. I mean, that's what happens here. So could we be more surgical about this, more thoughtful about this, about how to go back to work and how to go back to school? Our economy also depends on going back to school, and there's so many good things that come with going back to school. And I just wish that we were better at this, which is to say, wear masks, which is not that hard, social distance, and we can still get all those things because, I mean, you're right. Fear rules the day. If you look at going back to school as a perfect example of that, people are scared. The goal can't be to stop infection and stop death, because if that's the goal, then stay inside for the next 3 years. If the goal is to try and mitigate that, realizing there's still going to be some infection and some deaths, then we do have to get back out there again in the safest way possible. And I underline the safest way possible, but I also underline getting back out there again. And I think it's what's going to happen is this: we'll start to go back to schools. And then there will be transmission of virus, because that has to happen. And then there will be a teacher that gets sick, and then there will be a teacher that dies. And you will hear about that in the media for 3 days. And you should. But what that does is it teaches us what? Not to go back to school? No, it should teach us to go back to school in the safest manner as possible so you can mitigate the problem, but you're never going to eliminate the problem. That can't be the goal.
Professor, I cannot thank you enough for being a guest on The Doctor Is In, but I've got to close by thanking you more for a magnificent life and career. Winston Churchill said one time that bravery is the most primal of all virtues because it allows you to have the other ones. You have been fearless, you have been brave, besides being ridiculously intelligent and witty. It is a gift and honor to have you on this show. If I ever see you in a bar, I'm not buying a drink. It's all on me.
Well, the honor's mine. I'm not kidding. I have never really been interviewed by a fellow traveler as much as you. You have the same attitudes I do. So thank you.
Thank you. And for those out there watching, thanks for tuning into The Doctor's In. Be safe.